Headlights kept passing the wreck on Route 9 without slowing down, taillights blurring red through the snow and vanishing over the rise, one car after another for the better part of 20 minutes. Caleb Drake counted 4 of them before he understood what he was looking at on the shoulder. Half buried in drifting snow beside an abandoned sedan with its driver door hanging open, a dog stood rigid over a small shape wrapped in a coat, snow piling on its back, refusing to move even as the wind cut sideways across the highway, hard enough to stagger a grown man. Caleb pulled over before he'd finished processing what he'd seen. He was out of his truck before the engine had fully stopped, boots breaking through crusted snow, and the dog turned to face him with its teeth bared and its body planted directly between him and the bundle on the ground. It wasn't guarding the child from the cold. It was guarding the child from him, until it decided, in some silent calculation only the dog understood, that he could be trusted. Nobody else on that highway had stopped. Caleb would spend the rest of that night, and a long time afterward, wondering exactly how many drivers had seen the same thing he had and kept driving anyway. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from tonight in the comments below. If a story about a dog who refused to leave a child's side on the coldest night of the year and a Navy SEAL who couldn't drive past sounds like something your heart needs today, stay with us until the very end. What happened on that highway shoulder is going to remind you why some instincts are worth trusting completely. Caleb Drake was 39 years old, broad through the chest and shoulders in the dense, compact way of men who'd spent 2 decades being measured by what their bodies could endure rather than how they looked doing it. He kept his dark hair cropped close, and a thin scar ran through one eyebrow, a leftover from a training accident he rarely brought up. His eyes were a flat, watchful gray, the kind that swept a scene methodically before settling on anything, cataloging threats and exits out of a habit that had never once gone away since his last deployment. He wasn't a cold man, but he carried a stillness that made people instinctively lower their voices around him. The kind of contained force that never fully leaves men who spent years being the last line standing between chaos and the people who couldn't protect themselves. He moved through the world economically, without wasted motion, the permanent caution of someone who had learned exactly how fast a quiet moment could turn into something else entirely. He had served 14 years as a Navy SEAL, 4 deployments split between the Middle East, and a handful of places he still wasn't permitted to name out loud, the last of them ending with a rope extraction injury that tore the cartilage in his left knee badly enough to finally end his operational career. He'd left the Navy with no bitterness about it, only a quiet grief for the version of himself that used to know exactly what his purpose was each morning. Civilian life had been harder to navigate than anything overseas, in its own way. No clear mission, no team checking his 6, just long Montana winters and a contracting business he ran mostly alone. 8 months before that night on Route 9, his last working dog, a German shepherd named Bear, who'd been with him through most of his post-service years, had died quietly of old age in front of his fireplace, and Caleb hadn't been able to bring himself to get another one since. The truck had felt too quiet ever since. He hadn't admitted, even to himself, how much that silence had been wearing on him until the night a stranger's dog refused to let him near a freezing child on the side of a highway. The dog standing guard that night was a German shepherd mix, lean from what had clearly been a hard stretch of time without regular meals, with one ear torn nearly in half and a faded patch of scar tissue along his left flank that looked, even in the dark, like it had healed without ever seeing a veterinarian's hands. He carried himself with a wary, watchful intelligence that didn't match a dog who'd simply wandered up on a stranded car by accident. Every motion controlled, every glance calculated, the unmistakable bearing of an animal that had once been trained for something far more demanding than survival. He let Caleb approach only after Caleb knelt slowly in the snow, hands open, speaking low, and even the way he'd once spoken to frightened civilians in far worse places than a Montana highway. The dog stepped back exactly one pace, allowing access to the child without fully surrendering his post, and stayed pressed against Caleb's side for the rest of that night and every night that followed, as though some decision had already been made the moment Caleb knelt down instead of standing over him. Caleb would name him Titan 3 days later, once the adrenaline wore off enough to think of names at all, and would learn 6 weeks afterward, from a faded tattoo inside his good ear, that Titan had once been a working customs detection dog, reported missing from a kennel transport 2 states away nearly 3 years earlier, and simply never recovered. Route 9 ran flat and exposed through open ranch country 20 miles outside the nearest town, the kind of road where a single bad decision in a storm could leave a person stranded for hours before anyone noticed. The blizzard that night had dropped visibility to almost nothing. Snow moving sideways in the headlights, the temperature already past zero and falling fast enough that exposed skin would frostbite within 20 minutes. The sedan sat askew on the shoulder with one door open and the engine cold. No hazard lights, no flares, nothing to suggest anyone had planned to stop there at all. It was the kind of scene that told its own story before a single word was spoken. Something had gone wrong here fast, and whoever had been driving hadn't left by choice. The man responsible was named Wade Tolliver, an insurance adjuster in his early 30s whose uncle sat on the county commission and whose family name carried enough weight locally that 2 prior domestic disturbance calls involving him had quietly gone nowhere. The responding deputies each time choosing not to file formal charges after a private conversation nobody ever documented. He had been driving Hannah Ortiz and her 18-month-old daughter Lily back from a family gathering when an argument over money escalated, the way it always did, into something physical enough that Hannah had grabbed Lily from her car seat and run into the storm rather than stay in the vehicle with him a moment longer. Wade had driven off rather than chase her, telling himself, in the version of the story he'd already begun rehearsing, that she'd overreacted and would call someone for a ride once she cooled off. 2 people in town who knew him well enough to recognize the pattern had quietly warned Hannah, months earlier, that Wade had a way of making any conflict somehow become her fault by the time it was over. "Nobody's going to believe a word she says over me," he told a friend at a bar 2 nights after the incident, certain enough of his own standing in the county that he said it without lowering his voice. Hannah Ortiz was 26 years old, a nursing assistant working double shifts at the regional hospital to save enough to leave Wade permanently, a plan she had been quietly assembling for months, and a savings account he didn't know existed. When Caleb found her 20 minutes later, half buried in a drainage ditch 60 yards from the car, unconscious from hypothermia and a head wound from her fall, she had stripped off her own coat and wrapped it around Lily before collapsing, leaving herself exposed to a storm she had clearly known. On some level, she might not survive. She had told no one where she was going that night, certain that calling for help meant explaining things she wasn't ready to explain, and had simply run, trusting an instinct to protect her daughter over every other consideration, including her own survival. It was the coat wrapped twice around her sleeping daughter, found before Hannah herself was even discovered, that told Caleb everything he needed to know about the kind of mother he was looking for in that storm. Caleb called emergency services the moment he confirmed the child was breathing, then began working the ditch line on foot with Titan beside him, trusting the dog's nose over his own eyes in a whiteout that made visual searching nearly useless. Titan found Hannah in under 4 minutes, planting himself over her exactly as he had over Lily, and refusing to leave even when the ambulance crew arrived, until Caleb spoke to him directly, and the dog finally allowed the paramedics through. At the hospital that night, once Hannah regained consciousness long enough to speak, She told a sheriff's deputy a halting, frightened account of the argument in the car, careful not to say too much, watching the deputy's face for the same dismissive reaction she'd learned to expect from people who knew Wade's family. The deputy on duty that night, a younger officer named Reyes who hadn't grown up in the county and had no particular loyalty to the Tolliver name, wrote everything down without editing a word of it, and told Hannah, plainly, that nothing about what had happened to her and her daughter was her fault. Caleb, sitting in the hallway with Titan at his feet, made a decision that night that he wasn't going to let this story quietly disappear the way 2 prior ones apparently had. Wade Tolliver showed up at the hospital the next morning with flowers and an apology already rehearsed. And when hospital staff, following standard protocol, declined to let him see Hannah without her consent, his composure slipped just enough for Caleb, still in the waiting room, to see exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Wade demanded to know who Caleb was and why a stranger had any business in his family's affairs, and when Caleb told him, with complete calm, that he was the person who'd found Hannah and Lily in a ditch in a blizzard the night before, Wade's expression shifted from indignant to something colder. "You don't know what really happened out there," he said. "She's not exactly stable. Ask anyone who knows her." Caleb didn't answer him. He simply watched Wade leave and made a note, the way he'd learned to make notes about people whose first instinct under pressure was to discredit the victim before anyone had asked him a single direct question. Over the following 2 weeks, Caleb learned, through careful and patient inquiry rather than confrontation, exactly how deep the pattern ran. A hospital social worker, sympathetic and discreet, told him that Hannah had been treated twice before for injuries she'd attributed to falls. Both visits documented, but never escalated. A records request at the county courthouse, filed by a friend of Caleb's from his contracting work who happened to be a paralegal, turned up both prior domestic disturbance reports, each one closed without charges within 48 hours of being filed, both involving the same responding deputy, a man who had since retired and moved out of state. Deputy Reyes, reviewing the new case alongside the old ones, told Caleb privately that he found the pattern impossible to ignore and intended to pursue it properly this time, with or without pressure from above. An old high school friend of Hannah's, a woman named Priya who ran the diner downtown, came forward on her own once she heard what had happened, telling Reyes she'd witnessed Wade grab Hannah's arm hard enough to bruise it at a community event 8 months earlier, and had never said anything because she hadn't believed anyone would act on it. Titan, on the 2 occasions Caleb brought him near Wade's office downtown while running other errands, refused to approach the building at all, choosing instead to sit at the far edge of the parking lot and wait, the same unmovable stillness he'd shown on the highway shoulder. Caleb didn't share every detail with Hannah as he gathered it, not wanting to give her false hope before any of it was confirmed. But he kept a folder in his truck that grew thicker by the week. Copies of the old reports, Priya's signed statement, a timeline he'd built by hand the same way he'd once built mission briefs, each fact-checked twice before it earned a place on the page. He had learned a long time ago that the difference between a story nobody believed and a case that finally moved was almost always patience. And he had more of that now than he'd had in years. Wade's response, once he understood the story wasn't fading the way the previous 2 had, was to escalate through the one channel he still believed favored him completely. He filed for emergency custody of Lily, citing Hannah's hospitalization and a fabricated claim that she'd been intoxicated the night of the crash, a story built entirely around the fact that paramedics had found an open bottle of cold medicine in her glove compartment. His uncle, the county commissioner, made 2 phone calls that briefly threatened to fast-track the hearing before a judge with known ties to the family. And for nearly a week it looked, from where Hannah sat in a hospital bed, with a head wound still healing, like the truth simply wasn't going to be enough. She told Caleb, during one difficult visit, that she had genuinely begun to believe she might lose her daughter to the same man she'd nearly died trying to protect her from, and that nobody, not the hospital, not the county, not anyone, was going to stop it in time. Titan spent every one of those nights at the foot of Lily's hospital crib, refusing every attempt by staff to relocate him, an immovable presence that the night nurses eventually simply stopped fighting. Caleb sat with her through one of those long evenings, Titan stretched across the floor between them, and told her plainly that he had no intention of letting this go quiet a third time. Hannah didn't fully believe him. Not yet. She had been let down by enough people who'd promised to fix things before. But something in the way Titan refused to leave Lily's crib each night made the promise feel, at least, like it had somewhere solid to stand. The signal moment came the morning of the custody hearing, when Wade arrived at the courthouse with his attorney and found Caleb already waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom. Titan seated calmly but completely immovable directly in front of the door Wade needed to walk through. Wade told the dog, sharply, to move. Titan didn't. He simply held the position, ears forward, eyes fixed on Wade, with the same unblinking attention he'd once reserved for contraband hidden in cargo, and the hallway, crowded with attorneys and court staff arriving for the morning docket, went quiet enough that several heads turned to watch. "Get that animal out of my way," Wade said. "He's not in your way," Caleb said. "He's in the way of you getting through that door before the people inside finish reading what's already on the judge's desk." He told Wade then, with the same flat, unhurried calm he'd once used to brief commanding officers, exactly what had been assembled. That 2 prior domestic disturbance reports, improperly closed for years, had been formally reopened by Deputy Reyes and forwarded to the district attorney's office that same week. That Priya's witness statement, along with 2 hospital records the social worker had properly subpoenaed, directly contradicted the intoxication claim in Wade's custody petition. That a forensic toxicology report on the cold medicine bottle, ordered independently by Hannah's new attorney, showed levels consistent with a single dose taken days earlier, nowhere near the night in question. "You had every chance to walk away from this quietly," Caleb said. "That chance is over now." Wade's composure broke exactly the way it always eventually did for men who had never once faced real consequences before. First came outrage that this was a private family matter, that Caleb had no standing, no right, no understanding of the situation. Then came threats about his uncle, about lawyers, about how little Caleb understood about how this county actually worked. When none of it changed Caleb's expression, Wade's voice dropped into something thinner, an attempt to negotiate, to suggest there might be a way to handle this quietly that benefited everyone involved. Caleb didn't answer. The courtroom doors opened behind him, and the bailiff called the morning's first case, and Wade Tolliver walked through alone, his attorney already several steps ahead of him, into a hearing his uncle's phone calls had no further power to influence. The judge denied Wade's emergency custody petition that same morning, citing the reopened domestic violence reports and the toxicology results as sufficient cause for immediate dismissal. And within 6 weeks, the district attorney's office filed formal charges against Wade for 2 prior incidents of domestic assault. The case built almost entirely on records that had simply been waiting, ignored, for someone willing to look at them honestly. Wade's uncle, facing his own quiet scrutiny once a local reporter began asking pointed questions about a pattern of closed cases connected to his nephew, did not run for re-election that fall. Deputy Reyes was promoted to detective the following year, his name attached to a quiet but real reputation for taking reports seriously that other officers in his position once hadn't. 8 months later, the early summer sun spread warm across a small backyard on the edge of town, where Hannah sat in a folding chair watching Lily take unsteady, determined steps across the grass toward Titan, who lay patiently in the shade waiting for her the way he had every weekend since that night on Route 9. Hannah had moved into a small rental of her own, finally free of a savings account she no longer needed to keep secret, and had been promoted to full-time charge nursing assistant that spring. Wade Tolliver pleaded guilty that summer to 2 counts of domestic assault, a plea that included 18 months of supervised probation, a permanent restraining order, and supervised visitation only, monitored at a county facility for the foreseeable future. Caleb came by most weekends now, not entirely sure when the visits had stopped being about checking on Hannah and started being about something else neither of them had named yet. And Titan, freed for an afternoon from the weight of guarding anyone, tore across the yard, chasing a tennis ball Lily had thrown badly and gleefully, barking with the kind of pure, uncomplicated joy that no longer needed to watch the road for danger. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as rescue teams or sirens cutting through the dark. Sometimes they arrive as a stray dog on a frozen highway shoulder, standing guard over a child no one else had stopped for, refusing to move until the right person finally did. This story proves something the world too often makes us forget: that loyalty doesn't require a leash, a uniform, or an introduction, and that the smallest acts of refusal to look away can be the difference between a tragedy and a story worth telling. God does not always send help wrapped in the form we expect. Sometimes He sends it on 4 legs, half-starved and scarred, standing in a blizzard because something inside it had already decided that child was worth everything it had left to give. If this story touched your heart tonight, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that some instincts are always worth trusting. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever been the one who stopped when everyone else kept driving. We'd love to hear that story too. And if you believe in stories of courage, loyalty, and the quiet bravery of the ones who refuse to look away, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and give you the courage to be the one who stops.